Isabella, oh God. We shouldn't, the words were a broken prayer, a last shred of reason lost in the heat between them, his voice rough against the silk of her hair. Moonlight spilled across the vast, opulent bedroom, catching the sheen of sweat on their tangled bodies, turning the Egyptian cotton sheets into a silver sea. Her legs were wrapped around his waist, pulling him deeper, erasing any space, any doubt that might have lingered. A soft, desperate sound escaped her lips, a protest against his protest. "Hush, Liam, just for tonight." "Just feel this," she whispered, her voice a intoxicating mix of command and plea, her breath hot against his ear. He could feel the tremor that ran through her, the perfect manicured nails that dug gently into the muscles of his back, not in pain, but in a frantic need to anchor herself to this moment, this stolen reality. He surrendered, his own name a gasp on her lips, as the world outside the windows, the world of right and wrong, of her husband and his own simple life, simply dissolved into nothingness, leaving only the rhythm of their bodies and the deafening beat of two hearts committing the most beautiful, terrible sin. But this inferno, this all-consuming blaze, had started from the coldest of embers, 3 months prior. 3 months ago, Liam's hands were not tangled in her hair, but were calloused from gripping the handle of a heavy floor polisher. He wasn't in her bed, but on his knees, scrubbing the cavernous marble entryway of a home that felt more like a modern art museum than a place where people lived. He was the cleaner, a ghost in a palace of glass and stone, his purpose to erase any trace of life, of dust, of imperfection. And she, Isabella, was the queen of this silent kingdom. The first time he saw her, she was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a perfectly manicured garden, a vision in an emerald silk dress. She was breathtaking, less a person and more a masterpiece curated to fit the space. She had glanced at him, a fleeting, dismissive look, a slight nod that acknowledged his existence in the same way one might acknowledge a piece of furniture. In that moment, he was invisible, and the chasm between the boy with the mop and the woman in the window felt as vast and as cold as the marble beneath his feet. He never could have imagined that one day he would be the one to finally make a mess in her perfect, sterile world. The first day, the agency had given him a list of rules as long as his arm, a litany of do's and don'ts that all boiled down to a single, unspoken commandment: be invisible. He drove his sputtering 20-year-old sedan up the long, winding driveway, feeling the engine strain as if it, too, was intimidated by the sheer opulence of the destination. The house wasn't a house. It was a statement. A fortress of white stone and dark glass perched on a hill overlooking the city, it seemed to reject the very earth it was built on, a monument to a life so far removed from his own it might as well have been on another planet. He parked in a designated spot for staff, tucked away behind a meticulously trimmed hedge, a clear demarcation between their world and his. He walked toward the service entrance, the key card the agency provided feeling alien and heavy in his hand. The instructions were precise. Arrive at 9, enter through the back, begin in the main foyer, and under no circumstances, speak to the owners unless directly addressed. The moment he stepped inside, the silence hit him. It was a heavy, expensive silence, the kind that swallows sound whole. His worn-out sneakers, which seemed perfectly normal on the city pavement, suddenly squeaked with embarrassing loudness on the polished black marble floor. The air didn't smell like a home. There was no trace of coffee or cooking, no scent of life. Instead, it was a sterile, clean aroma, a professionally curated blend of something vaguely citrusy and cold, pumped through unseen vents. The foyer was a 2-story atrium with a chandelier that looked like a frozen explosion of crystal. In the center of the room stood a twisted metal sculpture he vaguely recognized from an art history textbook, a piece worth more than he would likely earn in his entire lifetime. He was an art student, meant to appreciate such things, but here it felt less like art and more like a declaration of power. This was not a space for living. It was a space for display. He felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach, the one that always appeared when he was confronted with this kind of effortless wealth, a mixture of awe, resentment, and a deep, gnawing sense of his own insignificance. He got to work, his movements practiced and efficient. He unpacked the high-end, eco-friendly cleaning supplies from the utility closet, another world away from the bleach and bargain brand soap he used in his own tiny apartment. As he worked, he fell into the rhythm of the job, the methodical wiping and polishing, a kind of meditation that allowed his mind to drift. He cleaned tables that had never held a family dinner, polished glass that reflected nothing but other expensive objects, and vacuumed rugs that were never meant to feel the tread of muddy shoes. He was a ghost, a shadow erasing the faint traces of other, more important ghosts. Hours passed in this silent, lonely dance. He had started to believe the house was entirely empty, a pristine shell waiting for inhabitants who might never arrive. He had just finished polishing the base of the grand staircase, the cool metal of the banister smooth beneath his cloth, when a sound from the adjacent room made him freeze. It was the soft, almost imperceptible click of a woman's heel on a hardwood floor. He held his breath, every muscle in his body tensing. It was the primal instinct of an intruder, the fear of being discovered, even though he was meant to be there. He stayed perfectly still, half hidden by the curve of the staircase, and listened. Then he saw her. She was in the formal living room, a vast space framed by an enormous archway. The morning light poured in from a wall of glass, illuminating her as if she were on a stage. And in that moment, she was the entire show. She stood with her back mostly to him, gazing out at the perfect, untouched garden, a white ceramic mug held delicately in one hand. She was tall, slender, and her posture was a study in effortless grace. A cascade of jet black hair fell down her back, so dark it seemed to drink the light. She was wearing a dress the color of deep emerald, a sheath of silk that didn't so much hang on her as it flowed, clinging to the subtle curve of her waist, hinting at the swell of her hips, and falling to just below her knees. To Liam, the art student, she was a Sargent painting come to life, all elegant lines and quiet, aristocratic beauty. He felt a jolt, a purely aesthetic shock that was quickly followed by a pang of something more visceral, something he immediately tried to suppress. It was inappropriate. It was dangerous. He was the help. He remained frozen, a statue of his own, watching her. She seemed lost in thought, a figure of profound, beautiful melancholy against the stark, modern lines of the room. He wondered what she was thinking about. Did a person who lived in a place like this have problems? Did she feel the same pangs of loneliness or boredom that he did? The thought seemed absurd. Her life was a masterpiece. His was a charcoal sketch, smudged and unfinished. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, she sighed, a sound so soft he almost didn't hear it. Then she turned. He saw her face for the first time. It was even more perfect than he had imagined. High cheekbones, a strong but delicate jawline, full lips painted a subtle shade of nude, and eyes, her eyes were a cool, intelligent gray, guarded and distant. They swept across the room with an air of casual ownership, taking in the clean surfaces, the perfectly arranged furniture, and then, for a single, heart-stopping second, they landed on him. His breath hitched. He felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck, certain he had been caught staring, caught in his lowly admiration. He braced himself for a sharp word, a reprimand, a call to his agency, but none of that came. Her expression didn't change. There was no flicker of surprise, no anger, not even curiosity. Her gaze passed over him as if he were a part of the architecture, a lamp, a shadow cast by the staircase. It was a look that didn't see him. It simply registered his presence as a functional object in the space. Then, she gave the slightest of nods, a minuscule, almost mechanical dip of her chin. It wasn't a greeting, it was an acknowledgement, a confirmation. The cleaner is here, the floor is being polished, all is as it should be. And then she was gone, walking away with that same soft clicking sound, disappearing down a long hallway. Liam was left alone in the silence, his heart hammering against his ribs. The air where she had stood seemed to shimmer. He finally understood the rules, not from the agency's list, but from that single dismissive glance. His job was not just to be invisible, it was to not exist at all. He was a pair of hands, a function, a tool to maintain the perfection of her world. He took a slow, shaky breath and went back to his work, but the image of her, the woman in the emerald dress, was burned into his mind. The cold, silent mansion suddenly had a secret, a pulse. And he knew with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him that he would spend the rest of his time there searching for it. The weeks that followed bled into a month, then two, and the grand, intimidating mansion slowly became familiar territory to Liam. The initial shock of its scale and opulence had dulled, replaced by a quiet, methodical rhythm. Tuesdays and Fridays were his days. He would let himself in through the service entrance at 9 o'clock sharp and begin his silent pilgrimage through the vast, empty rooms. He learned the house's geography not as a home, but as a collection of spaces, each with its own distinct character of disuse. There was the home theater in the basement, with its 2 rows of plush, reclining leather chairs and a screen the size of a billboard. He would dust the high-tech projector and wipe down the gleaming control panel, but the air was always still, holding no ghost of shared laughter or suspense. He would clean the formal dining room, where a magnificent mahogany table that could easily seat 20 sat perpetually unblemished, its mirror-like surface reflecting only the cold light from the chandelier above. The chairs, upholstered in pale velvet, remained perfectly aligned, sentinels guarding a feast that would never be served. His routine was a map of loneliness. He would move through the guest wings on the second floor, entire suites of rooms kept in a state of constant readiness for visitors who never seemed to materialize. He would smooth invisible wrinkles from perfectly made beds and replace toiletries that were never touched. He felt like an archaeologist in a pristine, modern ruin, cataloging the artifacts of a life that was either yet to happen or had long since passed. During this time, he rarely saw Isabella. She was a fleeting presence, a whisper in the grand silence. He would catch a glimpse of her leaving in an expensive car, a brief vision of sunglasses and a silk scarf, or he would hear the distant murmur of her voice on a phone call from behind a closed door. She remained the untouchable woman in the emerald dress, a beautiful, distant star around which this empty galaxy revolved. He never spoke to her, and she never acknowledged him beyond that first dismissive nod. He was, as the agency demanded, invisible. But as the weeks wore on, Liam's invisibility became his advantage. He was a silent observer, and he began to see things, small cracks in the perfect facade, tiny clues left behind by the mansion's lonely queen. He started to piece together a portrait of her, not from her presence, but from her absence, from the faint traces she left in her wake. He would find a single wine glass, its rim stained with the ghost of a deep red lipstick, left on the marble edge of the enormous bathtub in the master bathroom. It was always just one glass, a silent testament to a solitary, joyless indulgence. On her nightstand, there was a small stack of books. He would dust them carefully, noting the titles. They weren't the breezy bestsellers he expected, but worn paperbacks of tragic classics, Anna Karenina, The Age of Innocence, and collections of melancholic poetry. He noticed that the tassel of the bookmark in one of them, a volume of poems by Sylvia Plath, didn't move for 3 consecutive weeks. A story started, but perhaps too painful to continue. He learned that she was a woman who surrounded herself with the beautiful sorrows of others, perhaps as a way to understand her own. His most intimate discoveries, however, were made in the most mundane of places, the laundry room. It was a stark, white, ruthlessly organized space in the basement, filled with gleaming stainless steel machines. Part of his duties was to gather the laundry from the master suite and run the first loads of the day. He would enter the vast walk-in closet, a room larger than his own bedroom and kitchen combined, and retrieve the contents of a woven hamper. At first, the task was purely mechanical. He would sort the fabrics by color and texture as he'd been taught, the cashmere sweaters in one pile, the delicate silks in another. But then, his hands would inevitably find them, her underthings. The first time it happened, he froze. He was holding a wisp of black lace and silk, a bra so delicate it seemed impossible that it was a functional piece of clothing. It felt like a shocking, profound transgression. He was touching the most intimate layer of her, the secret armor she wore against her perfect skin. This became his weekly, secret ritual. Sorting her laundry became a moment of forbidden connection. He would handle the pieces with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. He discovered she favored deep, rich colors, burgundy, midnight blue, and the purest black. The fabrics were always the finest lace from France, the softest silk from Italy. They were impossibly beautiful, designed with an artistry that spoke of sensuality and passion. He would run his rough, cleaner's fingers over the intricate lacework, feel the cool, smooth glide of the silk. These were not the garments of a woman who felt plain or ignored. They were the clothes of a woman who knew her own beauty, who possessed a deep well of passion. And yet, the context of the silent mansion, the single wine glass, the sad books, told him that this passion had no audience. This beauty was a performance for an empty theater. He imagined her putting them on, the soft fabric against her skin, a secret act of self-adornment in a life devoid of genuine admiration. One Tuesday, his hands closed around a slip of ivory-colored silk, a chemise so light it felt like holding captured air. As he lifted it from the hamper, he caught it. Her scent. It wasn't just the expensive, floral perfume he sometimes smelled lingering in the hallways. It was something deeper, warmer, more fundamentally human. It was the scent of her skin, a faint, clean musk that clung to the fabric. He instinctively brought it closer, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second as he inhaled. In that moment, she was overwhelmingly real. She wasn't the distant painting in the window or the fleeting glimpse in the hallway. She was a warm, breathing woman who wore this silk against her body. The scent was a heady, intoxicating mix of manufactured elegance and raw humanity, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. A hot wave of arousal and shame washed over him simultaneously. He felt like a thief, a voyeur stealing a moment of intimacy he had no right to. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound deafening in the sterile silence of the laundry room. He quickly dropped the slip into the washing machine, his hands trembling slightly. He finished the task in a blur, his mind racing. The silent routine was no longer silent, it was now filled with her. The house was no longer just a collection of empty rooms. It was a diary, and he was learning to read its pages, to decipher the secret language of her profound and beautiful loneliness. It was a Friday in late October, and the sky had been a threatening shade of bruised purple all afternoon. Liam had been working with a nervous energy, trying to finish his checklist before the heavens inevitably broke open. He was polishing the last of the floor to ceiling windows in the solarium when the first fat drops of rain began to splatter against the glass, thick and heavy like thrown pebbles. Within minutes, the drizzle became a deluge. The wind howled, rattling the immaculate glass panes, and the world outside dissolved into a gray, churning chaos. His shift was over, but leaving was impossible. The long, winding driveway would be a treacherous river of mud, and his ancient car would never make it. Resigned, he packed his supplies and stood by the service door, a ghost in his designated purgatory, watching the storm and waiting for a miracle that wasn't coming. The rhythmic drumming of the rain was the only sound, a wild, chaotic heartbeat in the otherwise silent house. He must have stood there for 20 minutes before he heard the soft click of heels approaching from behind. He turned, expecting to see her walk past, perhaps on her way to the kitchen, and prepared to make himself as small as possible. But she stopped. She stood a few feet away, wrapped in a thick, cream-colored cashmere cardigan over silk lounge pants. Her hair was down, softer and less severe than usual, and she wore no makeup. In the dim, stormy light, she looked younger, more vulnerable. "You can't go out in that," she said. Her voice was quiet, a statement of fact, not a question. It was the most she had ever said to him. He was so startled he could only manage a slight, stupid-sounding, "No, ma'am." She looked at the torrent of water streaming down the glass door, then back at him. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her cool gray eyes. "It won't let up for a while. Come, wait in the library. I'll get you a drink, a real drink." The offer hung in the air between them, so far outside the established rules of their universe that Liam's mind struggled to process it. It was a shattering of protocol, a direct violation of the commandment of his invisibility. "I couldn't, ma'am. I'm fine right here," he stammered, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Don't be ridiculous. I won't have you standing in a hallway for hours. Come on." It was a polite command, one he knew he couldn't refuse. He followed her, his worn sneakers feeling sacrilegious on the antique Persian rugs that led to the library. The room was unlike the rest of the house. Where other spaces were cold and minimalist, the library was warm and lived in. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of dark mahogany were crammed with books, real books with cracked spines and dog-eared pages. 2 deep leather armchairs faced a grand, unlit fireplace. It was a sanctuary, and he was an intruder. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room, afraid to touch anything. Isabella moved to a small, polished bar cart in the corner. "Whiskey?" she asked, her back to him. "Yes, please," he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. He watched her hands as she poured, the steady, elegant way she handled the heavy crystal decanter. The amber liquid swirled into 2 tumblers, the sound of the ice clinking against the glass unnaturally loud. She turned and handed him a glass. For a brief, electric moment, her fingers brushed against his as he took it. Her skin was soft and cool. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. She gestured to one of the armchairs. "Please, sit." He did, perching uncomfortably on the edge of the plush leather. She took the opposite chair, curling her legs beneath her in a movement of fluid grace. The storm raged outside, cocooning them in the warm, quiet room. "The agency told me you're an art student," she said, breaking the silence. The statement caught him off guard. She had read his file. She knew a fact about him. "Yes," he said, surprised. "Portraiture, mostly." She took a slow sip of her whiskey, her eyes studying him over the rim of her glass. It was an unnerving, yet deeply flattering scrutiny. "What do you try to capture in a portrait?" she asked, her voice genuinely curious. "The truth, I guess," he answered, the whiskey warming his throat and loosening his tongue slightly. "The part of a person they don't realize they're showing the world, the things in their eyes." She held his gaze for a long moment, a sad, knowing little smile playing on her lips. "That sounds dangerous," she said softly. He felt a blush creep up his neck and took a gulp of his drink. He had to change the subject, to turn the lens away from himself. "Do you enjoy all of this?" he asked, making a vague gesture to the room, the house. She followed his gaze, looking around the library, as if seeing it for the first time. "This room, yes, it's the only one that feels like mine." She paused, swirling the ice in her glass. "My husband, Marcus, he has impeccable taste. He designed everything. He loves beautiful, perfect things." Her tone was flat, declarative, but underneath it, Liam heard the faintest tremor of something else. "He's in Singapore this month," she added, her voice dropping a little. "Or maybe it's Tokyo. It's hard to keep track." And there it was, the crack. A hairline fracture in the perfect porcelain facade. He saw a flicker of profound loneliness in her eyes, a weariness that all the money in the world couldn't erase. Now that he was this close, he could see the faint, feathery lines at the corners of those eyes, evidence of smiles that no longer reached them. He could see the pulse beating softly at the base of her throat, just above the delicate string of pearls she was unconsciously toying with, her thumb stroking one of the perfect spheres back and forth. Her perfume, a scent he had only ever caught in passing, now enveloped him. It wasn't a heavy, cloying fragrance, but something complex and intoxicating white gardenias, he thought, with a warm, woody base of sandalwood. It smelled like wealth, yes, but it also smelled like her, a scent of secret, hidden warmth. Her lips, which he'd only ever seen as a straight, neutral line, were softer up close, and they parted slightly when she spoke, revealing the glint of perfect white teeth. He was seeing the real Isabella, uncurated and unguarded, and the sight was more breathtaking than any of the art that filled her home. She looked back at him, her gaze direct and unsettlingly vulnerable. "This house is so beautiful, isn't it?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But sometimes the silence is so loud it feels like it's screaming." The confession, so raw and unexpected, hung between them. It was a bridge, a hand reaching across the vast chasm of their different worlds. He didn't know what to say, what comfort a person like him could possibly offer a person like her, so he just met her eyes, and for a long, silent moment, he let her see that he understood. He saw her loneliness, and he let her see that he saw it. Just then, a lull in the storm. The frantic drumming of the rain on the windows subsided to a gentle patter. The spell was broken. The real world, with its rules and its hierarchies, began to seep back into the room. A flicker of self-consciousness crossed her face. She straightened up, placing her glass on the table, her mask of polite distance slowly sliding back into place. "It sounds like it's clearing up," she said, her tone once again that of the lady of the house. Liam knew it was his cue. He finished his whiskey in one quick swallow and stood up. "Thank you, ma'am, for the drink." She just nodded, not quite meeting his eye. As he walked out of the library and back through the silent halls, he felt a profound shift inside him. He was no longer just the cleaner. He was Liam, the art student, and she was no longer the untouchable portrait. She was Isabella, and he had just seen the truth in her eyes. The Tuesday after the storm felt different. The air in the mansion was charged with a new kind of silence, one that was not empty but filled with a quiet, humming anticipation. When Liam arrived, he carried a knot of nervous energy in his stomach. He half expected Isabella to be absent, to have retreated back into her cool, distant world, treating their fireside conversation as a momentary aberration, a strange dream to be forgotten in the light of day. He was prepared for the return of the dismissive nod, the invisible wall slamming back into place between them. He was wrong. She was in the kitchen when he passed by, a room he usually found as sterile and unused as the rest of the house. She was standing by the large marble island, arranging a bouquet of white lilies in a vase, and she looked up as he walked past the doorway. Their eyes met, and she gave him a small, slow smile. It was not the polite, vacant smile of a society wife. It was genuine, a little shy, and it reached her eyes. "Good morning, Liam," she said, and the sound of his name in her voice, spoken so casually, so normally, was a quiet bombshell. "Good morning, ma'am," he replied, his voice a little too loud in the silent house. "Isabella," she corrected him gently, "please." That single exchange set the tone for the weeks that followed. The old rules were gone, replaced by a delicate, unspoken dance of proximity. Isabella was suddenly home far more often on his cleaning days. She no longer confined herself to the master wing but seemed to drift through the house, inevitably ending up in the same space as him. She would read a book in the library while he dusted the shelves, the only sound, the soft rustle of a turning page and the gentle whisk of his feather duster. She would sit in the solarium with a cup of tea while he cleaned the vast panes of glass, her reflection a constant, beautiful presence in his peripheral vision. Their conversations were light, trivial little islands in an ocean of unspoken tension. She would ask about his art classes, about a specific professor he'd mentioned, remembering details he was surprised she'd retained. He, in turn, would grow bold enough to ask about the book she was reading, or the music playing softly from a hidden speaker. They talked about everything and nothing, their words like carefully chosen stepping stones to avoid falling into the deep, churning waters of what was really happening between them. For Liam, his work became a strange form of torture and ecstasy. He was no longer a ghost in her home, he was an actor in a silent play, and she was his sole audience. He was acutely, painfully aware of her at all times. The air around her seemed to shimmer, to be physically thicker, charged with an energy that made the fine hairs on his arms stand up when she passed by. He learned the subtle orchestra of her presence, the soft pad of her bare feet on the cool marble, the faint, melodic clink of the ice in her water glass, the scent of her perfume that would announce her arrival in a room seconds before he saw her. His focus, once so disciplined, was now in tatters. He would find himself polishing the same spot on a silver frame for a full minute, his mind completely lost in watching the way the light from the window caught the highlights in her dark hair. He was an art student, trained to observe, and she had become his singular obsessive subject. He studied the way she moved, the inherent elegance in the simple act of her crossing a room or settling into a chair. He noticed the delicate line of her neck when she tilted her head to read, the vulnerable curve of her spine when she stretched after sitting for too long. He was no longer just seeing an expensive silk blouse. He was seeing the way the fabric pulled taut across her shoulder blades, the way it draped softly over the swell of her breasts, rising and falling with each quiet breath. He would watch her hands, the long, slender fingers, the perfectly shaped nails. He remembered the impossible softness of her skin from that briefest of moments their fingers had brushed when she handed him the whiskey glass, and the memory alone was enough to make his own hands feel clumsy and rough. This constant, close-range observation was building a pressure inside him, a desperate, aching need that was entirely separate from the boy who was just trying to earn enough money to pay his tuition. He was falling not just into lust, but into a deep, dangerous fascination with the woman herself, with the sad, beautiful mystery of her. The breaking point came on a bright Friday afternoon. The sunlight streamed into the main gallery, a long hallway lined with artwork that was, as Isabella had said, impeccably chosen but emotionally cold. All except one. It was a large, moody oil painting of a seascape, dark and turbulent. Liam had always been drawn to it. He was on a small, three-step ladder, carefully dusting its ornate gilded frame when she entered the hall. He heard her footsteps and his concentration immediately shattered. She didn't just walk past. She stopped at the base of his ladder, her presence immediately filling his senses. "That one was my choice," she said, her voice soft and close. He looked down at her. She was so near that he could see the flecks of silver in her gray eyes. "It's the only one." He swallowed, trying to find his voice. "It's beautiful," he said. "It feels real." She looked up at the painting, then back to him, a sad smile on her lips. "Yes, I suppose that's why it feels so out of place here." She stepped a little closer, tilting her head to look at a detail in the corner of the frame. "Marcus thinks it's too gloomy. He wants to replace it with a nice, cheerful abstract." As she spoke, she raised her hand to point at a small, carved detail on the frame he had just wiped. "Right there, you missed a little." Her fingers, so elegant and graceful, hovered in the air just inches from his own hand, which was still holding the dustcloth. And then it happened. As he moved his hand to follow her direction, and she moved hers to guide him, their fingers brushed. It wasn't a bump or a graze. For one single cataclysmic second, her fingers slid against his. It was a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity, a silent thunderclap in the quiet hall. Time seemed to warp, to slow down and stretch out, and in that moment, all he could feel was the shocking warmth of her skin against his, the impossible softness of her touch. It was a brand, a spark that lit a fuse that had been laid down for weeks. They both pulled their hands back at the same instant, as if they had touched a live wire. He stumbled slightly on the ladder, his heart leaping into his throat. He looked down at her, and her eyes, wide and startled, were locked on his. And in that shared gaze, the charade was over. There was no more pretending, no more hiding behind polite conversation and stolen glances. Everything they hadn't said, everything they had been feeling, was laid bare in that one look. He saw shock, fear, and a raw, undeniable flicker of the same desperate wanting that was consuming him. The air crackled. The space between them was no longer a respectful distance. It was a chasm of terrifying possibility. She was the first to break the gaze, murmuring a flustered, "I'm sorry," before turning and walking away quickly, her composure, for the first time, completely shattered. Liam remained on the ladder, his hand tingling, his entire body trembling. He could still feel her. The lingering touch was no longer a memory. It was a promise, a point of no return, and he knew with a terrifying certainty that he was going to fall. The Tuesday after their touch was a day of quiet thunder. The charged energy that had been humming beneath the surface of their interactions was now a low, constant roar that vibrated in the very air between them. The polite, fragile bridge of small talk they had built was gone, washed away by the flood of that single electric moment. Now, there was only a heavy, knowing silence. When their eyes met across a room, they no longer smiled. They simply looked, their gazes holding for a fraction too long, filled with a raw and unnerving honesty. He could see the questions in her eyes, the same ones that were screaming in his own mind. He was no longer just the cleaner, and she was no longer just the lady of the house. They were a man and a woman who had acknowledged a dangerous truth, and neither of them knew what to do with it. He tried to lose himself in his work, to focus on the methodical rhythm of polishing and scrubbing, but his senses were heightened to an almost painful degree. Every sound she made was amplified. Every movement she executed was a magnetic pull on his attention. He felt as though a string had been tied from his chest to hers, and with every step she took, it pulled him tighter. And he started to notice that she was testing that string, pulling it, seeing how much tension it could hold before it snapped. The invitations began subtly, small gestures that were just ambiguous enough to be denied. One afternoon, as he was vacuuming the long upstairs hallway, he noticed the door to her walk-in closet. A room he knew she kept meticulously private was ajar. He heard the soft rustle of fabric from within and averted his eyes, focusing on the patterns in the Persian runner, his cheeks flushing with heat. But his gaze was a traitor, flicking back to the doorway against his will. For a single, heart-stopping second, he saw her move past the opening. It was a fleeting, impressionistic glimpse. The pale, luminous curve of her bare back, the the sharp, delicate knobs of her spine, her dark hair pinned loosely on top of her head, exposing the exquisitely vulnerable nape of her neck. Then she was gone. The image, chaste as it was, felt profoundly, shockingly intimate. It was burned onto the back of his eyelids. He stood frozen, the roar of the vacuum cleaner deafening in his ears. Was it an accident, or was it a gift? A deliberate crack in her armor, left open for him to see through. The thought that she might have done it on purpose, for him, sent a dizzying, terrifying thrill through his entire body. The ultimate test, however, came later that same day. His final task was always the master suite. He approached the grand, double doors with a sense of both dread and electric anticipation. He raised his hand and knocked softly, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet hall. "Isabella?" he called out, his voice feeling strange and unfamiliar. Silence. He waited a full minute, his ear pressed against the cold wood. Nothing. Protocol dictated he could now enter. He took a deep breath, his hand trembling slightly as he turned the heavy brass knob and pushed the door open. The room was cast in a dim, golden twilight. The heavy damask curtains had been partially drawn, filtering the harsh afternoon sun into a soft, hazy glow. The air was cool and still, and the only sound was the whisper-quiet hum of the central air. And in the center of the room, on the vast, immaculate white sea of the king-sized bed, she was lying there. For a moment, he thought she might be hurt. He took a half step into the room, his heart seizing in his chest. But then he saw the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her back and realized she was asleep. Or, at least, she appeared to be. She was on her side, facing away from him, her body curled in a posture of soft vulnerability. A pearl-white silk comforter was pooled around her waist, but it had slipped from her shoulders, leaving her upper body exposed to his gaze. She was wearing a nightgown of the sheerest black lace, a delicate wisp of a thing that seemed to serve no purpose other than to frame and accentuate the beauty of her skin. A single, thin strap cut a dark, stark line across the pale cream of her shoulder. Where the comforter ended, the gown did little to conceal, and he could see the soft upper curve of her breast, a perfect, shadowed swell against the fragile lace. Her dark hair, usually constrained in an elegant knot or a perfect glossy curtain, was unbound, fanned out across the white silk pillows like a spill of dark ink. A few stray strands clung to the side of her neck. Her lips, he could just see from this angle, were slightly parted. Liam stood rooted to the spot, just inside the doorway, a prisoner of the scene before him. This was not a glimpse through a cracked door. This was a full, uncurried exhibition of her private self. His mind screamed at him to leave. Get out, close the door, pretend you saw nothing. It was his duty, his one remaining shred of decency, but his body refused to obey. His feet felt like they were encased in lead. Desire, a feeling he had been trying to manage and suppress for weeks, now surged through him, hot and undeniable, a physical ache that tightened his chest and groin. He was a voyeur. The thought was ugly, shameful, but it was the truth. He was devouring her with his eyes, taking in every detail, the elegant line of her shoulder blade, the impossibly smooth texture of her skin in the dim light, the way the delicate lace seemed to melt into her form. The scene felt staged, a perfect tableau of sleeping beauty. The ambiguity was excruciating. Was she truly asleep, lost in an innocent afternoon dream? Or was this a performance, a silent, daring invitation? I am here. I am vulnerable. I am yours to look at. What will you do now? The unspoken question hung in the cool, still air, as tangible as her perfume. He imagined crossing the plush carpet, the silence of his footsteps. He imagined reaching out, his rough fingers tracing the line of her shoulder, feeling her skin warm beneath his touch. The fantasy was so vivid, so powerful, it made him feel dizzy. A war raged within him. The cleaner, the student, the decent young man he thought he was, fought against the primal, predatory male that she had awakened in him. Guilt and lust churned in his gut, a sickening, intoxicating cocktail. This was wrong on every level. She was his employer. She was a married woman. He was a boy, trespassing in a world, and now a bedroom, where he did not belong. After an eternity that was likely only 30 seconds, the shame finally won. But it was a hollow victory. With excruciating slowness, he took a step back, his eyes still locked on her sleeping form, then another. He pulled the heavy door toward him, his hand shaking so badly he was afraid the latch would rattle. He eased it shut until it clicked with a soft, final thud that echoed in his soul. He was back in the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs as if it wanted to escape. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the door, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He had walked away. He had refused the unspoken invitation. But as he stood there, trembling in the silent hall, he knew it wasn't an ending. It was a prelude. The question had been asked, and his retreat was not a no. It was a terrified, unwilling not yet. The silence in the mansion that Friday was heavier than ever before. Liam moved through the rooms with a ghost tread, his mind a constant, replaying loop of the scene in the bedroom. He had spent the last 2 days in a state of suspended animation, caught between the shame of what he had done and the agonizing thrill of what it had meant. He was terrified of seeing her, of the conversation they would have to have, or worse, the one they wouldn't. He cleaned with a frantic, almost violent energy, punishing the dust, scrubbing the floors, trying to sweat out the tension coiling in his gut. He managed to avoid her for the first few hours, a small mercy. He told himself it was for the best, that perhaps she was giving him space, that they could both pretend it never happened and revert to the old, safe silence. But he knew, with a certainty that made his hands tremble, that it was too late for that. The unspoken had been shown, and it could not be unseen. His duties eventually led him to the library. He paused at the doorway, steeling himself. This was her sanctuary, the heart of her lonely kingdom. If she was anywhere, she would be here. He pushed the door open, and was met not with the sight of her reading in her favorite chair, but with a sound. It was a tiny, almost inaudible noise, a small, choked gasp, like someone trying to swallow a sob. He froze, and then he saw her. She was curled into one of the massive leather armchairs, her back to the door, wearing a simple gray sweater. Her shoulders were trembling, a slight, rhythmic shudder that was the only movement in the quiet room. The sight of her, the composed, untouchable Isabella, so completely and utterly broken, was like a physical blow. It shattered the last of his fear, replacing it with a wave of fierce, protective empathy. His training, his instincts, the voice of the agency in his head all screamed at him to retreat. Be invisible. This is not your business. This is a private grief. Leave. He took a half step back, his heel sinking silently into the plush carpet, but he couldn't. The memory of her sleeping form, the imagined vulnerability, was now a devastating reality before him. He could no more walk away from her now than he could stop his own heart from beating. Her pain was a physical force, a magnetic pull that drew him into the room against all reason. On a small table beside her, her phone lay face up, its screen glowing. Though he tried not to look, his eyes caught the last text message, a short, brutal line of black text on a white background. Deal in Hong Kong closing. Can't make it. Sorry. The casual, almost indifferent cruelty of it hit him like a punch. Sorry. A 4-letter word to erase a promise, to dismiss a hope. He moved silently, his footsteps swallowed by the rug. He came to a stop just behind her chair, so close he could smell the faint, clean scent of her hair. He could see the tension in her neck, the way her hands were clenched into tight fists in her lap. For a moment, he just stood there, his mind a complete blank. What could he possibly say? What comfort could the cleaner offer the queen in her crumbling castle? Words were useless, hollow things, so he acted. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a fraction of a second, a silent question, before he gently, tentatively placed it on her shoulder. Her entire body went rigid. A sharp, shocked intake of breath was her only response. He felt the jolt of her surprise travel up his arm. He thought for a terrible second that he had made a catastrophic error, that she would lash out, tell him to get away from her. But then, the tension seemed to drain out of her in a long, shuddering sigh. She didn't pull away. Instead, she sagged slightly, leaning almost imperceptibly into his touch. Slowly, she turned her head, her neck arching gracefully as she looked up at him, and the sight of her face wrecked him. The perfect mask was gone, shattered into a million pieces. Her beautiful gray eyes were red-rimmed and swimming in unshed tears. Faint, gray tracks of mascara stained her high cheekbones. Her lips, usually so perfectly composed, were trembling and pale. She was a ruin. And in that ruin, He saw a vulnerability so profound, so desperate, it stole the breath from his lungs. Her gaze was a raw, silent plea. "See me. Please. Just for a moment. See me." He moved around the chair and knelt before her, the rough fabric of his work jeans pressing into the expensive carpet. He was on her level now, the chasm of their social standing momentarily erased. He didn't speak. He simply lifted his free hand, the one that wasn't still resting on her shoulder, and with a tenderness he didn't know he possessed, he used his thumb to wipe a tear from her cheek. His skin was rough and calloused against hers, a contrast of two different worlds. He traced the wet path down to the corner of her mouth, his thumb brushing against the soft, trembling curve of her lips. They parted slightly, a soft, involuntary gasp. It was everything. It was permission. It was surrender. The world outside the library, the storm, her husband, his job. It all dissolved into a distant, meaningless hum. There was only this. He leaned in, his eyes locked on hers, giving her every possible second to turn away, to stop him. She didn't move. She just watched him come closer, her tear-filled eyes holding his. He kissed her. The first touch of their lips was impossibly gentle. A soft, tentative press meant only to comfort. It tasted of salt and sorrow. She let out a small, broken whimper, a sound that was half sob, half sigh, and the last of her resistance crumbled. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his shoulders, and the kiss deepened, no longer just a comfort, but a question. His tongue traced the seam of her lips, and she opened for him, a silent answer. And then, all the weeks of suppressed longing, of stolen glances, of simmering tension, finally erupted. The kiss turned hungry, desperate. It was a collision, a frantic, searching exploration, not just of mouths, but of souls. It was a kiss that spoke of profound loneliness and a desperate, shared need to finally be seen. She pulled back for a breath, a fraction of an inch, her hands moving to his chest, as if to push him away. "Liam," she breathed, her voice a ragged, broken whisper. "Number. We can't. Please." The words were a ghost of a protest, a final, futile nod to the rules they were shattering. Even as she spoke them, her fingers were curling, twisting into the thick cotton of his shirt, holding on, pulling him closer. Her body betrayed her words, telling him the truth he already knew. He answered her not with words, but with another kiss, silencing her weak protest, consuming it with his own need. And this time she met him with a ferocious passion of her own, her mouth molding perfectly to his. He slid his arms around her, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other wrapping around her slender waist. He rose from his knees, lifting her effortlessly from the chair and into his arms. She let out a small gasp of surprise against his lips, and her arms, which had been on his chest, snaked around his neck, holding on to him as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. Instinct took over, a primal, undeniable force. Her legs, of their own accord, wrapped around his waist, locking him to her. The contact was a full-body shock of heat and softness, the feeling of her pressed against him so overwhelming it almost brought him to his knees. He buried his face in the curve of her neck, inhaling her scent, a dizzying mix of perfume and tears. He was carrying her. He had taken her. He turned, and in 3 short, decisive steps, he carried her to the large leather sofa against the far wall. The first surrender was over. The true one was about to begin. The moment he laid her down on the cool, dark leather of the sofa, the world seemed to stop. The frantic, desperate energy of their kiss subsided for a single, breathless second. He was propped up on his elbows above her, and they just looked at each other, their faces inches apart. In her wide, tear-bright eyes, he saw a maelstrom of emotions, fear, wild abandon, and a profound, aching vulnerability that mirrored his own. There were no more words to be said, no more protests to be made. This was it, the final, silent consent. He lowered his head and kissed her again, and this time there was no sorrow, no comfort, only a raw, mutual hunger that had been starved for far too long. His hands, which had been holding her so carefully, began to explore with a desperate, clumsy urgency. They were still separated by too many layers of fabric, too many reminders of the separate worlds they inhabited. He fumbled for the hem of her soft gray sweater, his fingers catching in the fine-knit cashmere. It was a mundane, clumsy barrier to the fantasy that lay beneath, and he tugged at it with a frustrated groan. She let out a soft, breathy laugh against his lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated release. And then she moved, her own hands reaching up to grip the sweater and pull it over her head in one swift, decisive motion. She tossed it aside without looking, a careless dismissal of her daytime armor, and then, there it was. The reality of the secret he had only ever discovered in the sterile confines of the laundry room, the black lace. It was even more devastatingly beautiful on her skin than he had ever imagined. The bra was a delicate cage of intricate patterns, lifting and framing her breasts, its thin straps a stark, dark contrast to the pale cream of her shoulders and chest. A matching pair of lace panties sat low on her hips, a final, fragile shield. The sight of her, the lonely, elegant wife in her sad gray sweater, now revealed as this creature of secret, sensual fire, stole the air from his lungs. "Isabella," he breathed, the name a prayer, an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. "You're so beautiful." He lowered his head, his lips tracing the upper curve of the lace, his senses overwhelmed by the scent of her perfume and the warm, intoxicating scent of her skin. He felt a tremor run through her body as his mouth moved lower, into the valley between her breasts. One of his hands slid down from her shoulder, over the silk of her rib cage, to the flat, soft plane of her stomach. He felt her muscles quiver and contract under his touch. She was so exquisitely made, a masterpiece of soft curves and elegant lines that he, the humble art student, was now somehow allowed to touch. His hand moved lower, tracing the line of her hip, his thumb hooking into the delicate edge of her panties. She let out a sharp, shuddering gasp, her hips arching instinctively into his touch. "Oh, Liam," she whispered, her voice a ragged, broken thing. "This is so wrong." The words were meant to be a protest, but they had no conviction. They were a sigh of surrender, an acknowledgement of the beautiful, terrible sin they were committing. The word wrong was an aphrodisiac, a validation of the wild, illicit thrill of the moment. The rain, which had subsided, seemed to hear their passion and returned with a renewed fury. A sudden gust of wind lashed a sheet of water against the library's large windows, a sound like 1,000 tiny pebbles being thrown against the glass. The storm outside was a perfect mirror for the tempest they were unleashing within the warm, quiet room. Her hands, which had been resting on his shoulders, moved upwards, tangling in his hair, pulling him closer, demanding more. He accepted the invitation, his mouth returning to hers in a deep, bruising kiss, while his other hand moved to her back, searching for the clasp of her bra. He fumbled with the tiny hooks and eyes, his fingers feeling thick and clumsy. She arched her back, pressing her breasts against his chest, a silent offering of assistance. The clasp gave way. He slid the straps from her shoulders, pushing the lace aside, and her breasts, fuller and more perfect than he could have fantasized, spilled free. They were pale, luminous globes in the dim, stormy light, tipped with dark, taut peaks that seemed to ache for his touch. He worshipped her with his hands, his mouth, until she was writhing beneath him, soft, guttural moans escaping her lips with every ragged breath. The sounds in the room began to blend into a wild, primal symphony. The frantic drumming of the rain against the glass, the soft, rhythmic creak of the old leather sofa, his own harsh breathing, and her beautiful broken cries. He divested her of the last piece of lace, his eyes feasting on the sight of her, completely bare, completely open, completely his in this one stolen moment. The contrast of her pale, luminous skin against the dark, almost black leather was the most exquisite work of art he had ever witnessed. He moved to shed his own clothes, his movements frantic, his eyes never leaving hers. And in that moment he saw that the tears had returned to her eyes, but these were not the tears of sorrow he had found her with. They were tears of a different kind of release, of disbelief, of a pleasure so intense it bordered on pain. "Please, Liam," she begged, though what she was pleading for he wasn't sure. More, or for it to stop, it didn't matter. They were past the point of stopping. He moved between her legs, her body parting for him, welcoming him. He pushed into her slowly, the feeling so intense, so overwhelmingly perfect that he had to grit his teeth to keep from crying out. Her eyes went wide, a gasp tearing from her throat as their bodies became one. For a moment, they were both perfectly still, two halves of a secret finally made whole, the only movement the frantic rise and fall of their chests. Then, she began to move her hips, a slow, tentative rhythm that quickly grew more confident, more demanding. "Harder," she whispered, the word a desperate, shocking command that shattered his control. He drove into her, again and again, their bodies finding a frantic, perfect rhythm that matched the lashing of the rain outside. He heard his own voice, as if from a great distance, chanting her name like an incantation. He heard her cries, which were no longer soft and suppressed, but loud and triumphant, the sounds of a woman reclaiming a part of herself that had been dormant for far too long. He felt the tension in her body coiling, tightening, her nails digging into his back, her hips rising to meet his every thrust. He watched her face as the climax took her head thrown back, her back arching off the sofa, a beautiful, shattering cry torn from the very depths of her soul. The sight of her, so completely lost in a pleasure he was giving her, was his undoing. He followed her into the abyss, his own release a violent, shuddering wave that left him utterly, completely spent, collapsing on top of her. The passionate downpour, both inside and out, was over. He walked into the mansion the following Tuesday with the memory of their bodies on the leather sofa branded into his mind. The air was different. The heavy, volatile tension that had preceded their surrender was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, a shared, conspiratorial intimacy. He saw her in the main gallery, the same hallway where their fingers had first brushed. She was arranging a vase of flowers, and when she saw him, her movements didn't falter. She simply looked up, and a slow, secret smile spread across her lips, a smile meant only for him. He felt an answering smile tug at his own mouth. In that single, silent exchange, a new world was born, a secret republic with a population of 2, hidden within the cold marble borders of her husband's empire. The cleaner and the lady of the house were gone. In their place were Liam and Isabella, partners in a beautiful, reckless crime. Their first encounter had been a frantic, desperate exorcism of loneliness and long-suppressed desire. What followed was a deliberate, joyful exploration. The cold, sterile rooms of the mansion, once monuments to a life not being lived, became their playground. They were reclaiming the spaces, filling the expensive silence with their own sounds, their own life, their own heat. They became bolder, more daring, their passion amplified by the thrill of the forbidden, the risk of discovery, a potent aphrodisiac. One sun-drenched afternoon, he found her in the kitchen, and without a word, she led him to the center of the room and pulled him down onto the floor. They made love on the cool, unforgiving marble, the afternoon light streaming through the massive windows, their bodies slick with sweat, every sound they made echoing in the cavernous space. The cold stone was a shocking contrast to their heated skin, a constant reminder of where they were and the illicit nature of what they were doing. Another day, they found themselves in the basement steam room, a space of tile and mist. They shed their clothes and stepped into the thick, white fog. He couldn't see her clearly, could only make out her silhouette, a ghostly, feminine shape in the haze. He found her by the sound of her breathing, his hands exploring her wet, slick skin, discovering her by touch alone. Their whispers were muffled by the steam, their moans swallowed by the hiss of the vents, creating a primal, sensory world where only touch and sound existed. They moved against the tiled walls, their bodies slippery and hot, lost in a world of their own making. They even ventured outside, to the vast, silent swimming pool, one moonless night. They slipped into the cool, dark water, the shock of it making them gasp and laugh like children. They swam to the deep end, and he pressed her against the wall, the water lapping around their shoulders as they moved together, their bodies weightless and free. They were utterly exposed, visible to any curious eye from the house, but in their bubble of desire, they felt invincible. More than the locations, it was the language between them that changed. The stilted, polite conversations were a distant memory. In their secret world, they spoke a new dialect, a language of pure, unadulterated intimacy. The tentative, questioning touches were replaced by confident, knowing caresses. She, especially, began to transform before his eyes. The sad, passive woman from the library was disappearing, replaced by a confident, sensual creature who was finally awakening to her own power and her own pleasure. Her token protests were gone, burned away in the heat of their first encounter. In their place were soft moans that grew into demanding cries and whispered words that made his blood run hot. She was no longer just a participant in their affair. She was its architect. One afternoon, they were in her bed, the vast sea of white sheets that he had once looked upon with such a mixture of fear and reverence. The curtains were drawn and they were tangled together in the lazy golden light, their bodies slick and warm. This was not the frantic coupling of the kitchen floor or the desperate passion of the library sofa. This was slow, languid, and deeply intimate. He was lying on his back, and she was propped on an elbow beside him, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his chest. He watched her, mesmerized by the light in her eyes, a spark he had never seen before he had touched her. She leaned in close, her hair falling like a dark curtain around them, her lips brushing against his ear. "Liam," she whispered, her voice a low, husky tremor that vibrated through his entire body. "Tell me what you want." The question was a gift, a transfer of power, an explicit invitation to voice the desires he had barely allowed himself to think. He turned his head, his lips finding hers. "You, Isabella," he whispered back against her mouth. "Just you, like this, always." Her response was a deep, throaty sound of approval. She took his hand and guided it down her body, over the flat plane of her stomach, lower, showing him what she wanted, what she needed, with a confidence that left him breathless. There was no shame in her touch, no hesitation. She was a woman reclaiming her own body, and she was inviting him to be a part of that reclamation. As they made love, she was an active, vocal participant, her voice a running commentary of her pleasure. "Yes, right there. Don't stop." She would urge him, her hips rising to meet him. She would cry out his name at her peak, not as a gasp, but as a triumphant shout that she no longer tried to suppress. He learned her body like a language, and she, in turn, learned how to ask for what she craved. She was no longer the sad, beautiful portrait he had admired from afar. She was a living, breathing, demanding woman, and he had somehow been the one to awaken her. But even within their perfect, passionate bubble, the outside world remained a constant, silent threat. He would see a photograph on her nightstand, Isabella, and a handsome older man, both smiling on a yacht, the picture of a perfect, wealthy couple. They would be in the middle of a deep, soul-shattering kiss when her phone would buzz on the table, the screen lighting up with the name Marcus's. She would ignore it, her eyes closing as she pulled Liam deeper, but the interruption was a chilling reminder. Their secret world was a stolen one, their time was borrowed. Every ecstatic moment was lived on the edge of a cliff, and they both knew, in the quiet moments after their passion had subsided, when they were lying tangled in her sheets, that eventually they would have to look down. For now, however, they chose not to. They simply held on to each other, speaking their secret language, pretending that this, their beautiful, forbidden reality, was the only one that mattered. Their secret world, so vibrant and intoxicating, existed outside of time. For weeks, they had lived in a blissful, suspended reality, a continuous present tense of stolen afternoons and whispered secrets, governed only by the rhythm of their own desire. The future was a foreign country they had no plans to visit, but the real world, with its schedules and its obligations, does not tolerate such rebellions for long. The future arrived, as it always does, without warning, announced by the shrill, intrusive ringing of a telephone. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and they were in her bed, tangled in the white silk sheets, their bodies languid and sated in the warm, dusty shafts of sunlight filtering through the curtains. It was a moment of perfect, drowsy peace. He was tracing the curve of her hip with his finger, mesmerized by the simple, profound fact of her presence, when the landline on her nightstand buzzed. It was a sound he had never heard before. She only ever used her cell phone. The sound was harsh, archaic, an unwelcome intrusion from another era. She stiffened in his arms. He felt the soft, relaxed muscles of her body instantly tense. She stared at the phone as it buzzed again, a look of dread dawning on her face. With a sigh of pure resignation, she reached over and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" The change was instantaneous and brutal. He watched, from his intimate vantage point in her bed, as Isabella, his lover, vanished, and Mrs. Davenport, the lady of the house, took her place. Her back straightened. The soft, sensual curve of her lips tightened into a polite, neutral line. Her voice, which had been a husky, intimate whisper moments before, became crisp and cool, a tone he hadn't heard since those first few weeks. "Marcus." "Darling," she said, and the word darling was a shard of ice in the warm, sunlit room. Liam felt a cold dread wash over him. He lay perfectly still, a naked, illicit secret in her husband's bed as she listened. "Oh," she said, "that's wonderful news. So soon?" A pause. He could hear the faint, tinny sound of a man's voice on the other end of the line. "Of course," she continued, her voice impossibly smooth. "No, the house is perfect. I'll have everything ready. Your favorite scotch is stocked." "Yes, darling. I can't wait. See you Friday." She placed the receiver back in its cradle with a soft, final click. The silence that fell in the room was nothing like the comfortable, intimate silence they had shared before. This was a dead, heavy silence, thick with everything that had just been reintroduced into their world: husbands, obligations, lies, and endings. He watched her, waiting. She didn't look at him. She simply stared at the wall opposite the bed, her expression completely blank. He saw her pull the silk sheet higher, covering her breasts, a gesture of sudden, reflexive modesty that felt more like a rejection than any words could. The bubble hadn't just been pricked. It had been vaporized. "Marcus?" he finally asked, the name feeling like a poison on his tongue. She nodded once, her gaze still fixed on the wall. "He's coming home," she said, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Friday. Friday." The word hung in the air, a death sentence. It was only 3 days away. The effect of that single word was to instantly transform their passionate affair into a frantic, heartbreaking tragedy. The joy was gone, replaced by a desperate, panicked grief. Their time together was no longer an infinite, luxurious ocean, but a rapidly draining hourglass. They began to hoard moments, to cram a lifetime of sensations into the few hours they had left. Their lovemaking lost its languid, exploratory quality and became something else entirely, a frantic, almost violent attempt to forge memories powerful enough to survive the coming drought. Their kisses were deeper, more bruising, tinged with the salty taste of unshed tears. Their touches were no longer just for pleasure, but were desperate acts of memorization, his hands mapping the curve of her spine, the swell of her hip, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, as if they could keep the feeling of each other on their skin forever. The recklessness that had once been so thrilling now became a symptom of their despair. Caution was a luxury they could no longer afford. They took foolish risks, not out of a sense of joyful rebellion, but out of a nihilistic disregard for the consequences. On Thursday, the day before his return, they made love in the formal living room in the middle of the afternoon, with the heavy curtains thrown wide open, the room flooded with bright, unforgiving sunlight. It was a silent, desperate act of defiance, a way of screaming their existence into the universe before it was erased. He felt a constant, gnawing anxiety, but he was swept up in her frantic energy, a need to feel, to burn, to consume every last second before the clock struck midnight. Their secret language changed, too. The intimate, sensual whispers were replaced by the clipped, desperate fragments of two people on the edge of a cliff. "What are we going to do?" he asked her once, as they lay tangled in the aftermath of another frantic coupling. She put a finger to his lips, her eyes dark with a pain she refused to acknowledge. "Don't," she whispered, her voice fierce. "Don't talk about it. We have today, and we have tomorrow morning. That's all. Let's not waste a second of it on talking about Friday." She was trying to exist only in the present, to outrun the future by refusing to look at it, but its shadow was inescapable. It was there in the way she held him afterwards, a little too tightly, a little too long. It was there in the moments when he would catch her staring into space, her face a mask of quiet, heartbreaking sorrow. For Liam, the news of Marcus's return was a brutal awakening. The confidence he had built, the feeling of belonging he had started to nurture in their secret world, all of it evaporated, revealing the flimsy foundation it was built on. He was the cleaner, the boy from the other side of the tracks. He was a temporary guest in a life he could never inhabit. As he lay in her bed, surrounded by the opulent trappings of her husband's wealth, he was crushed by the weight of his own inadequacy, his own impermanence. She was not his. This room was not his. This life was a fantasy, and the final credits were about to roll. He wasn't just losing a lover, he was being evicted from the only reality where he had ever felt truly, completely seen. The shadow of Marcus's return was more than just a threat. It was a reassertion of the natural order of things, an order in which he had no place beside her. And as Thursday afternoon bled into evening, the shadow was no longer looming. It was here, a cold and invisible presence in the bed with them, waiting to reclaim everything they had stolen. Friday arrived, not with the drama of a storm, but with the quiet, clinical cruelty of a perfect, sunny morning, the day of Marcus's return. Liam's hands were unsteady as he drove through the gates, his stomach a hollow, aching void. The mansion, which had become the stage for his secret life, was already in the process of transforming back into a world where he didn't belong. A catering van was parked discreetly near the service entrance. A woman he'd never seen before was arranging an obscenely large bouquet of white roses in the main foyer. The house was being scrubbed of their affair, polished and prepped for the return of its king. He was just another part of that preparation, the cleaner, there to erase the last traces of any imperfection, the irony of which was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. He was there to help erase himself. He went about his duties mechanically, his body on autopilot, his mind a million miles away. He avoided the other staff, moving like a shadow through the hallways, his heart pounding with a slow, heavy dread. He didn't know if he would see her, or how they could possibly say goodbye in a house that was now buzzing with activity. He saved the library for last, his own private, desperate hope. It was where they had truly found each other, and it felt like the only place they could possibly lose each other. When he finally pushed the door open, his heart leaped into his throat. She was there. She was standing by the large window, looking out at the flawless garden, a solitary figure in a simple blue dress. She was a near-perfect echo of the very first time he had seen her, but the chasm between them was no longer one of social status, but of shared, unbearable grief. She must have heard him enter, but she didn't turn. He closed the door behind him, the soft click of the latch sealing them in. One last time, he walked toward her, and the air was thick with unspoken words, with the crushing weight of their ending. He stopped a few feet behind her. "Isabella," he said, and his voice was a rough, unfamiliar sound. She finally turned, and her face was a mask of calm, placid beauty, the one she would wear for her husband. But her eyes, her sad, gray eyes, betrayed her. They were filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to pull him in. There was no plan, no discussion. Their bodies simply knew what they had to do. This was not about passion or lust or rebellion anymore. This was a ritual, a farewell. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers cold. She led him away from the window, away from the bright, mocking sunlight, to the dark, secluded corner of the library where the large leather sofa sat like a silent, loyal witness. There, in the shadows, she began to undress him, her movements slow, deliberate, her eyes never leaving his. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons of his work shirt, and he covered her hands with his own, stilling them. He shook his head gently and began to undress her instead, unzipping her dress with a slow, reverent pull. He wanted to be the one to do this, to memorize this one last act. He peeled the dress from her shoulders, letting it fall in a pool of blue silk at her feet. She stood before him in the simple, elegant lingerie he now knew so well, and he committed the sight to memory, burning it into his mind's eye. Their lovemaking was a dance of ghosts, a slow, aching ballad of goodbye. Every touch was a conscious act of preservation. He was no longer just a lover, he was an archivist, desperately trying to catalog a history that was about to be sealed away forever. He kissed the small dark mole on her shoulder, a tiny, perfect imperfection that he felt was his alone to know. His fingers traced the delicate blue veins on the inside of her wrist, the faint, silvery lines of a stretch mark on her hip. He watched her face with a painful, desperate intensity, memorizing the way her eyelashes, so dark and thick, cast feathery shadows on her cheeks when she closed her eyes. He saw the way her brow furrowed in concentration just as her pleasure began to build, and he saw the way she bit her full lower lip, a tiny, unconscious gesture she always made a second before she climaxed. These were his secrets, the details of the real Isabella that her husband would never know, the treasures he would have to carry with him in the long, empty years to come. He was inside her, moving with a slowness that was almost unbearable, trying to stretch this final moment into an eternity. He felt overwhelmed, choked by a love and a grief so immense he couldn't contain it. He opened his mouth to say something, to tell her everything she had come to mean to him, to beg her, to plead. "Isabella," he started, but his voice broke, the name dissolving into a strangled sob. All the words he wanted to say, "I love you, don't forget me, please don't let this be the end," died in his throat. She seemed to understand. She reached up and placed her palm gently on his cheek, her thumb stroking away a tear he didn't even realize he had shed. Her own eyes were shimmering. "Don't say anything, Liam," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "There's nothing to say. Just remember this. Remember me. It was not a request, it was a command." His final duty. Her words broke the last of their restraint. He moved faster, deeper, a frantic final dance against the dying of the light. Their climax was a painful, beautiful collision of ecstasy and agony. He felt her body tense and then shatter beneath his, and her cry was not the triumphant shout of their afternoons in her bed, but a raw, tearing sound, a sob ripped from the very depths of her soul. He followed her into that abyss, his own release a wave of pure, undiluted loss. As their bodies shuddered in the aftershocks, he felt a warm wetness on his own cheek and realized it was a tear that had escaped her closed eye, a final, salty offering from her grief to his. It was the most profound and painful connection they had ever shared, finding the peak of their intimacy in the very moment of their absolute, irrevocable end. Afterwards, there was no lingering. To stay would be to invite a pain neither of them could bear. They dressed in a heavy, clumsy silence, the spell broken, the magic gone. They were once again the cleaner and the lady of the house. He was just a boy in a cheap work shirt, and she was the stunningly beautiful wife of a very rich man, adjusting her dress, smoothing her hair, preparing herself for her real life. He picked up his cleaning supplies, his hands feeling like foreign objects. He had to go. He had to finish his work before the master returned. He walked to the door of the library, every step an agony. He paused with his hand on the knob and allowed himself one last look back. She hadn't moved. She was standing in the center of the room, a vision of impossible grace and heartbreaking sorrow. She looked at him, and her eyes said everything her lips could not. "Thank you. I'm sorry. Goodbye." He gave her a single, solemn nod, and then he turned and walked away, closing the door on their secret world for the last and final time. He shouldn't have gone back. Every rational part of his brain told him to call the agency, make up an excuse he was sick. He found another job. Anything but his heart was a traitor, and it led him, 1 week later, back up the long, winding driveway. He drove with a sense of grim, funereal purpose. He needed to see it to witness the aftermath, to confirm that the world he had inhabited for a few beautiful, impossible months had truly been erased. The house was different the moment he stepped inside. The profound, heavy silence he had come to know so well was gone, replaced by the sounds of a life being lived. A deep, confident baritone voice Marcus's drifted from a study down the hall, the sound of a business call being conducted with effortless authority. Classical music, a brisk and triumphant piece by Vivaldi, played from unseen speakers. A man's expensive leather briefcase sat on the console table in the foyer, and a dark wool overcoat was slung over a chair, casual acts of ownership that staked a claim on the territory Liam had once considered, foolishly, to be neutral ground. The mansion was no longer a lonely museum. It was a home. It was Marcus Davenport's home. And Liam was, once again, just the cleaner. He moved through the rooms with his head down, his movements quiet and furtive. The invisibility he had once chafed against now felt like a necessary shield, a cloak he pulled tightly around himself to ward off the cold reality of his new old position. Every room was a minefield of memories, every surface a ghost of a shared touch. He polished the kitchen island and saw not the reflection of the overhead lights in the cold marble, but the ghost of their two bodies, entwined in the afternoon sun. He dusted the leather sofa in the library and could almost feel the memory of her weight in his arms, could almost taste the salt of her tears on his lips. He was an archaeologist of his own heartbreak, and the pain was a clean, sharp thing, excruciatingly precise. He worked with a frantic, desperate efficiency, wanting only to finish, to escape before he was forced to see her. But the universe, in its infinite cruelty, would not grant him that small mercy. He was in the grand living room, wiping down the glass of a display cabinet, when he heard their voices approaching. He froze, his back to the entryway, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. He could only stand there, a rag in his hand, and wait for the execution. They entered the room, their voices filling the space. Marcus was laughing at something she had said, a deep, easy laugh that spoke of a casual, comfortable intimacy Liam had never known with her. He risked a glance at their reflection in the glass he was pretending to clean. Marcus was exactly as he had imagined. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, handsome in that effortless, powerful way that comes with a lifetime of wealth and success. He looked like he belonged there, like he had been sculpted from the same expensive materials as the house itself. And Isabella, she was a stranger. She was transformed, remade into the perfect portrait of a devoted wife. She was wearing a chic, conservative cream-colored dress, her dark hair pulled back in a flawless chignon, a string of perfect pearls at her throat. Her makeup was immaculate, her smile bright and attentive as she listened to her husband. She was a work of art, a masterpiece of social grace and wifely perfection. She was not the woman who had cried in his arms in the library. She was not the creature of sensual fire who had screamed his name in her bed. That woman was gone, locked away in a secret room inside this perfect, polished stranger. Marcus put his arm around her waist, a gesture of casual, unquestioned ownership, and pulled her against his side. She leaned into him, her smile never faltering, a seamless and brilliant performance. And Liam had to watch it all, a ghost at the feast, the living, breathing evidence of a secret that only he, it now seemed, still remembered. Then it happened. As Marcus turned his head to look at a painting on the wall, Isabella's gaze drifted over her husband's shoulder and across the vast room. For one single, eternal, soul-shattering second, her eyes met Liam's. The polite, practiced smile on her lips did not change, but her eyes, for an instant, the mask dropped. He saw it. He saw everything. He saw the frantic, passionate downpour in the library, the cool marble of the kitchen floor, the taste of her tears, the secret mole on her shoulder, the whispered sound of his name in the dark. He saw the memory of their entire world, of the life they had stolen, flash in the depths of her gray eyes. It was a look of shared history, of profound, unspeakable regret, and of a final, crushing goodbye. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. She blinked, and the light in her eyes was extinguished. They were once again the cool, placid, unreadable eyes of Mrs. Marcus Davenport. The connection was severed. The door was closed. He didn't remember finishing his work. He moved in a fog of pure, anesthetic shock. He packed his supplies, walked on unsteady legs to the service entrance, and stepped out into the late afternoon air. He didn't need to quit. He knew with absolute certainty that he could never come back. He could never again walk these halls as a ghost, haunted by the life he had briefly touched. He got into his old beaten-up car and closed the door, the sound a dull thud of finality. And as the air settled in the small space, he smelled it. Faint, almost imperceptible but unmistakable, her perfume. It had clung to the fabric of his jacket from their last, frantic embrace, a single, stubborn molecule of their shared past. And he knew in that moment that he could wash that jacket 1,000 times. He could burn it, he could throw it away, but he would never, ever be free of that scent. It was the ghost he would have to carry with him forever. He started the engine, the familiar, sputtering sound, a sad echo of his own broken heart, and drove away from the magnificent, brightly lit mansion on the hill. He did not look back. There was nothing left to see but the beautiful, gilded cage where he had once, for a very short time, learned how to fly.